They say that blood is thicker than water, that family will always have your back when the world turns against you. But sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who sits at your dinner table, smiles at your jokes, and calls you Mom. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and for 67 years, I believed that love and kindness would always be returned in kind, especially from those closest to my heart. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I realized my daughter-in-law was trying to kill me wasn't when I found the strange white powder in my morning tea, or when I started feeling violently ill after every family dinner. It wasn't even when I caught her researching untraceable poisons on her laptop. The moment of crystal clear certainty came when I heard her on the phone with someone, her voice dripping with false grief as she said, "I don't think Eleanor is going to make it through the night. The doctor says her heart is just giving up. It's so tragic, really, but at least she won't suffer much longer." The problem was, I was supposed to be dead already. What happened next would expose a web of greed, manipulation, and attempted murder that shocked our quiet town of Willowbrook Creek and sent ripples through 3 generations of my family. But more importantly, it taught me that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to be a victim, even when, especially when, the person trying to destroy you is family. I never imagined my golden years would unfold this way. At 67, I should have been tending to my prized rose garden, spoiling my grandchildren, and enjoying the comfortable retirement I'd worked so hard to achieve. Instead, I found myself playing dead in my own home, gathering evidence that my son's wife, sweet, caring Vivian Clearwater, who everyone adored, was systematically poisoning me with the intention of collecting on a life insurance policy she'd secretly taken out in my name. My story begins in the rolling hills of northern Vermont, in the picturesque town of Willowbrook Creek, where I'd lived my entire adult life. After my husband Theodore passed away 8 years ago, I thought I'd found my new normal. Our son Benjamin had married Vivian 3 years prior, and she'd seamlessly inserted herself into our family dynamic. She was charming, attentive, always volunteering to help with my medications, always insisting on preparing my meals when she visited. "Eleanor, you just sit and relax," she'd say with that bright smile of hers, her auburn hair catching the kitchen light as she bustled around my home. "Let me take care of everything. That's what family does for each other." For months I was grateful. After Theodore's death, the loneliness had been crushing, and having Vivian's enthusiastic care felt like a blessing. She'd arrive every Tuesday and Friday without fail, bringing casseroles, organizing my pill dispenser, even doing my grocery shopping. Benjamin would beam with pride, telling everyone how lucky he was to have married such a caring woman who loved his mother like her own. But slowly, insidiously, my health began to deteriorate. It started with fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. Then came the digestive issues, the dizzy spells, the racing heart that would wake me gasping in the middle of the night. My doctor, Dr. Patricia Holloway at Willowbrook Medical Center, ran test after test, but everything came back inconclusive. "Sometimes aging just catches up with us all at once," she'd say sympathetically. "We'll keep monitoring your symptoms." The strange thing was, I only felt truly terrible on Tuesdays and Fridays, coincidentally the days Vivian visited. I brushed off the correlation at first. Surely I was being paranoid, looking for patterns that didn't exist. Vivian was nothing but helpful, nothing but loving. She'd hold my hair back when I was sick, bring me herbal teas to settle my stomach, stay late into the evening to make sure I was comfortable. How could I even think such horrible thoughts about someone who clearly cared so much? But suspicion, once planted, has a way of growing. The turning point came on a rainy October evening when Vivian thought I was sleeping. I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness. Another episode that had left me weak and disoriented after dinner. Through my partially closed bedroom door, I heard her voice, low and urgent, speaking on her phone. "The old woman is tougher than I expected," she was saying. "I've been increasing the doses, but she keeps bouncing back. Maybe I need to try a different approach. My blood turned to ice. Old woman, increasing doses. Don't worry, Vivian continued, her voice taking on that sickeningly sweet tone I'd grown to associate with her public persona. By Christmas, this will all be over. Benjamin will inherit everything, and we'll finally be able to start our real life together. The life we deserve. In that moment, lying in my darkened bedroom listening to my daughter-in-law plan my death, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't confront her. I wouldn't run to the police with nothing but suspicions and overheard conversations. Instead, I would do something far more strategic. I would let Vivian Clearwater think she had succeeded in killing me. What unfolded over the next several months was a dangerous game of deception, a careful balancing act between staying alive and appearing to be dying, all while secretly gathering the evidence that would eventually put my would-be murderer behind bars. I documented everything: the powders I found hidden in her purse, the timing of my attacks, the insurance documents I discovered she'd forged in my name. But the real shock came when I learned I wasn't her first victim. The investigation that followed my death would uncover a pattern of behavior that stretched back years, involving two previous elderly relatives who had died under mysterious circumstances, both leaving Vivian as their primary beneficiary. What the authorities thought were natural deaths were, in fact, carefully orchestrated murders. The day I walked into that courtroom, very much alive and ready to testify, Vivian's face went white as a sheet. The woman who had spent months slowly poisoning me, who had attended my fake funeral with crocodile tears, who had already started spending what she thought was her inheritance, finally understood that her victim had been one step ahead all along. But this story isn't just about revenge or justice, though both play their parts. It's about discovering strength you never knew you possessed, about learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be someone else's victim, even when that someone is family. It's about the shocking lengths people will go to for money, and the even more shocking resilience of the human spirit when pushed to its absolute limits. Over the next 45 minutes, I'll take you through every terrifying, infuriating, and ultimately empowering moment of this journey. You'll learn how I stayed one step ahead of a calculating killer, how I built an airtight case from beyond the grave, and how I found the courage to face down the woman who tried to steal not just my life but my legacy. This is the story of how I died and came back to deliver justice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My story begins in the autumn of my life, in a place where stories like mine weren't supposed to happen. Willowbrook Creek, Vermont, population 4,200, was the kind of town where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone was sick, where the biggest scandal was usually who forgot to return their library books on time. Tree-lined streets wound past Victorian houses with wrap-around porches, and Main Street still boasted a genuine five-and-dime store run by the same family for 3 generations. I'd built my entire adult life in this peaceful corner of New England. For 43 years, I worked as the head librarian at Willowbrook Elementary School, watching generations of children discover the magic of reading. There's something profoundly satisfying about seeing a reluctant 8-year-old leave your library clutching a book they can't wait to finish, or helping a shy teenager find the perfect novel that makes them feel less alone in the world. Theodore and I had moved to Willowbrook Creek as newlyweds in 1978, young and full of dreams about the family we'd raise and the life we'd build together. He was a master carpenter who could transform a piece of raw wood into something beautiful with just his hands and his imagination. Our house on Maple Ridge Lane was his masterpiece. Every shelf, every cabinet, every piece of trim, carved with the kind of attention to detail that you simply don't see anymore. We were what you might call pillars of the community, though we never thought of ourselves that way. Theodore served on the town council for 15 years, and I organized the annual summer reading program that brought authors and storytellers to our little library. We attended St. Andrew's Methodist Church every Sunday, sang in the choir, and hosted the church potluck in our backyard every 4th of July. Our son Benjamin was our greatest joy, and, if I'm being honest, probably our greatest mistake in terms of how we raised him. Born after 7 years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages, Benjamin was our miracle baby, and we treated him as such, perhaps too much so. Where other children had chores and responsibilities, Benjamin had our undivided attention and endless indulgence. Theodore built him elaborate tree houses and go-kart tracks, while I made sure he never wanted for anything. The latest toys, the best clothes, every opportunity we could afford, and some we couldn't. Looking back now, I can see how our overwhelming love created some troubling patterns. Benjamin grew up expecting the world to revolve around his needs and desires. When he struggled with math, we hired tutors instead of making him work harder. When he quit baseball because he didn't like practicing, we didn't insist he honor his commitment to the team. When he wrecked his first car at 17, we immediately bought him another one, better than the first. Benjamin was charming, there's no denying that. He had Theodore's warm brown eyes and easy smile, and he could talk his way out of almost any situation. Teachers loved him despite his inconsistent performance, and he had a knack for making friends wherever he went. But underneath that charm, there was always an expectation that things should come easily to him, that problems were someone else's responsibility to solve. After high school, he drifted through 3 different colleges, changing majors repeatedly before finally settling on business administration, not because he was passionate about it, but because it seemed like the path of least resistance to a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Theodore and I, of course, paid for every semester, every dorm room, every fresh start. When Benjamin graduated at 24, we helped him get his first apartment, co-signed his car loan, and even provided a down payment when he decided to buy a small condo across town. "Just until I get established in my career," he'd say, and we'd nod understandingly. Theodore and I had worked hard our whole lives. We wanted our son to have an easier path than we'd had. The career part proved challenging. Benjamin worked for a series of local businesses, an insurance office, a real estate company, a marketing firm, but nothing ever seemed to stick. There was always a problem with management, always a personality conflict, always a reason why this particular job wasn't working out. Each time he quit or was let go, he'd show up at our door looking sheepish and defeated, and we'd welcome him back with open arms and a home-cooked meal. By the time Benjamin turned 32, Theodore and I had begun to worry privately about his future. He was bright and personable, but he seemed to lack the drive and persistence that career success required. We'd catch ourselves making excuses for him to friends and neighbors, explaining away his latest job change or failed venture with increasing discomfort. Then, like a bolt of lightning on a clear day, Vivian Clearwater entered our lives. Benjamin met her at a coffee shop in nearby Montpelier, where she worked as a freelance graphic designer. She was 28, strikingly beautiful with that auburn hair and emerald green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she laughed. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in Benjamin, hanging on his every word and treating him like he was the most fascinating man she'd ever met. When Benjamin brought her home for dinner that first time, Theodore and I were cautiously optimistic. Vivian was polite and well-spoken, asking thoughtful questions about our lives and expressing genuine interest in our answers. She admired Theodore's woodwork, complimented my cooking, and seemed to genuinely enjoy our company. "Your son is such a catch," she told me that evening as we cleared the dinner dishes. "You and Mr. Hartwell raised him right. He's so kind and generous, not like the selfish men I usually meet." The courtship was swift and intense. Within 3 months, Vivian was spending most nights at Benjamin's condo. Within 6 months, she'd moved in officially. They seemed genuinely happy together, and Benjamin appeared more focused and motivated than he'd been in years. He landed a job at a local marketing firm and actually kept it for more than a year, something that Theodore and I privately celebrated as a major victory. Vivian had a way of making everyone feel special and appreciated. She remembered birthdays, asked about my volunteer work at the library, and even helped Theodore organize his workshop when his arthritis started making it difficult for him to manage the heavy tools. When she suggested they get married after dating for 2 years, Theodore and I couldn't have been more pleased. The wedding was modest but beautiful, held in our backyard under the ancient oak tree that had shaded our property since before we'd bought the house. Vivian looked radiant in a simple ivory dress, and Benjamin couldn't stop smiling. As I watched them exchange vows, I felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude. Finally, our son had found someone who would be his partner in building a stable, adult life. What I didn't know then was that Vivian Clearwater had already begun researching my financial situation, my medical history, and the most undetectable ways to commit murder. The first year of their marriage seemed like a fairy tale. Benjamin kept his job and even got promoted to account manager. They moved into a larger apartment and began talking about buying a house. Vivian started her own design business from home and quickly built up a roster of local clients. She was involved in everything: the church social committee, the library fundraising board, even the neighborhood watch program. Most importantly, from my perspective, she seemed to genuinely care about family. She called me twice a week just to chat, remembered every holiday and special occasion, and made a point of including Theodore and me in their social activities. When Theodore began showing signs of the heart disease that would eventually take his life, Vivian was right there alongside Benjamin and me, helping with doctor appointments and making sure he took his medications. Looking back now, I wonder if she was already studying us then, learning our routines and vulnerabilities, figuring out who would be the easiest target when the time came to put her plan into action. Theodore passed away on a snowy February morning, peacefully in his sleep after a massive heart attack. The grief was overwhelming. Losing your life partner after 41 years of marriage is like losing half of yourself. But Vivian was there every step of the way, helping with funeral arrangements, managing the flood of casseroles and condolence cards, and making sure I ate and slept during those first devastating weeks. "You don't have to go through this alone, Eleanor," she'd say, holding my hand as I cried. "We're family now, and family takes care of each other." Those words would come back to haunt me in the most terrible way imaginable. The catalyst that would change my life forever came exactly 8 months after Theodore's funeral, on a crisp October morning that started like any other but ended with my world turned upside down. I had been adjusting to widowhood better than I'd expected, though the loneliness still hit me in unexpected waves. The house felt too quiet sometimes, especially in the evenings when Theodore and I used to sit on the front porch discussing our day. But I'd found new routines, new purposes. I volunteered 3 days a week at the Willowbrook Community Center, teaching basic computer skills to other seniors. I'd joined a book club at the library, where I'd worked for so many decades. Most importantly, I'd begun to feel like I could envision a future for myself that wasn't defined entirely by loss. That particular morning, I was in my garden, carefully preparing my prized rose bushes for the coming winter. Theodore had always handled the outdoor maintenance, but I'd discovered that I actually enjoyed the physical work, the connection to the earth, the satisfaction of nurturing something beautiful. The October air was crisp and clean, with that particular clarity that comes just before the leaves reach their peak colors. I was kneeling beside my favorite bush, a deep red variety that Theodore had planted for our 20th wedding anniversary, when I heard the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway. Looking up, I saw Vivian's silver Honda Civic, and my heart immediately lightened. Her visits had become one of the brightest spots in my week, though I'd noticed they'd become more frequent since Theodore's passing. Eleanor, she called out, her voice carrying that musical quality that had charmed everyone from the first day Benjamin brought her home. I brought supplies for your famous apple cinnamon muffins. I thought we could bake together and then take some to Mrs. Patterson next door. Benjamin told me she's been feeling under the weather. This was typical Vivian, always thinking of others, always finding ways to spread kindness throughout our little community. She appeared around the corner of the house carrying 2 grocery bags, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight like spun copper. She was dressed in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made her green eyes seem even more vibrant. "You're such a thoughtful girl," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves and accepting her warm hug. "But you didn't need to buy ingredients. I have everything we need in the kitchen." "I know, but I wanted to contribute something," she insisted, linking her arm through mine as we walked toward the house. "Besides, I got some of that expensive vanilla extract from the gourmet shop in Montpelier. I thought it might make the muffins extra special." We spent the next 2 hours in my kitchen, flour dusting every surface as we laughed and talked our way through 24 muffins. Vivian had a gift for conversation, moving effortlessly from light gossip about our neighbors to deeper discussions about life, loss, and the future. She asked thoughtful questions about my marriage to Theodore, about raising Benjamin, about the dreams I'd had to set aside when life took unexpected turns. "You know, Eleanor," she said as we waited for the second batch to finish baking, "I hope I can be half the woman you are when I reach your age. The way you've handled everything. Theodore's illness, losing him, learning to live on your own. It's truly inspiring." Her words warmed me more than the heat from the oven. In the months since Theodore's death, I'd often felt invisible, as if I'd become just another elderly widow that younger people politely acknowledged but didn't really see. Vivian made me feel valued, interesting, worthy of attention and respect. After the muffins cooled, we packaged most of them in decorative tins, some for Mrs. Patterson, some for the church bake sale, some for Benjamin to take to work. I insisted Vivian take a dozen home, along with the recipe card that had been my mother's before it was mine. "Stay for lunch," I urged, as she gathered her purse and keys. "I made that chicken salad you love so much." "I wish I could," she said, glancing at her watch with what appeared to be genuine regret. "But I have a client meeting this afternoon, and I still need to finish preparing my presentation. Rain check?" After she left, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced in months. There was something about Vivian's presence that made even ordinary activities feel special, meaningful. I found myself humming as I cleaned the kitchen, planning our next baking adventure, thinking about how lucky Benjamin was to have found such a wonderful partner. It was around 3 o'clock that afternoon when the first wave of nausea hit me. I was sitting in my living room, reading a mystery novel that the book club would be discussing next week, when my stomach suddenly cramped with violent intensity. The feeling was unlike anything I'd experienced. Not the gradual onset of stomach flu or food poisoning, but a sudden, overwhelming assault that left me gasping and clutching my abdomen. Within minutes, I was vomiting uncontrollably, my entire body racked with spasms that seemed to go on forever. Between episodes, I managed to call Dr. Holloway's office, but her receptionist informed me that the doctor was at the hospital and wouldn't be back until the following morning. "If it's an emergency, you should go to the emergency room," the woman advised. But even as I considered calling an ambulance, the symptoms began to subside. The cramping eased, the nausea faded, and I was left feeling weak and shaky but no longer actively ill. Whatever had hit me seemed to be passing, and I convinced myself it was probably just something I'd eaten, though I couldn't think of anything that might have caused such a violent reaction. Benjamin called that evening, as he did most nights since his father's death, to check on me. When I mentioned feeling sick earlier, he immediately went into protective son mode. "Mom, you should have called me right away," he scolded gently. "I would have come over, taken you to the doctor. You can't just tough these things out anymore." "I'm fine now, sweetheart," I assured him. "Really. It was probably just a 24-hour bug or something." Vivian mentioned you two spent the morning baking. Maybe you just overdid it? You're not as young as you used to be, and all that standing and mixing. His concern was touching, even if his suggestion that I was too old for normal activities stung a little. After we hung up, I went to bed early, still feeling drained, but chalking the whole episode up to one of those random health hiccups that happen more frequently as we age. 3 days later, it happened again. This time, the attack came in the evening, about 2 hours after Vivian had stopped by with a homemade casserole. "Tuna noodle," she'd announced proudly. I found the recipe in one of those vintage church cookbooks at the thrift store. The woman there said it was a real crowd pleaser back in the day. The casserole had been delicious, creamy and comforting, exactly the kind of meal that reminded me of church potlucks from decades past. Vivian had stayed for dinner, regaling me with stories about her latest design projects and asking detailed questions about my volunteer work at the community center. But by 8 o'clock, I was once again doubled over with excruciating stomach cramps, followed by the same violent nausea and vomiting I'd experienced 3 days earlier. This time, the episode lasted longer and left me even more depleted. I spent most of the following day in bed, sipping ginger ale and wondering if I was developing some kind of chronic digestive condition. When Benjamin stopped by the next afternoon to check on me, he found me still in my robe, pale and exhausted. "This is it, Mom," he declared firmly. "I'm calling Dr. Holloway and making you an appointment. This isn't normal, and I'm worried about you." Dr. Patricia Holloway had been my physician for over 15 years. A competent and caring woman who had guided me through menopause, Theodore's heart condition, and the various minor ailments that had cropped up over the decades. Her examination was thorough but revealed nothing obviously wrong. My vital signs were normal, my blood pressure was actually better than it had been in years, and she could find no physical abnormalities that might explain my symptoms. "Sometimes these digestive upsets can be related to stress," she suggested gently. "Grief affects people in many different ways, and it's not uncommon for emotional distress to manifest as physical symptoms. The body and mind are more connected than we often realize." She prescribed a mild anti-nausea medication and suggested I keep a food diary to see if we could identify any triggers. "If this continues or gets worse, we'll run some more comprehensive tests," she assured me. "But for now, I think we're looking at a stress-related condition that should improve with time." I left her office feeling somewhat reassured, but also frustrated. I didn't feel particularly stressed. If anything, I'd been feeling more positive about life than I had since Theodore's death. But doctors know best, and if Dr. Holloway thought grief might be manifesting in unexpected ways, I was willing to accept her professional judgment. For the next 2 weeks, I felt completely normal. I returned to my regular routines, continued my volunteer work, and even hosted the book club meeting at my house. The mysterious stomach episodes seemed to be behind me, just as Dr. Holloway had predicted. Then Vivian came by with another casserole, this one a hearty beef stew that she'd made especially for the cooling weather. And 6 hours later, I was once again writhing in agony, my body rejecting everything I tried to consume, my strength ebbing with each violent spasm. That's when the terrible suspicion first took root in my mind. A thought so horrible, so unthinkable, that I immediately tried to push it away. But once the seed was planted, it grew with inexorable persistence, fed by a growing pattern that I could no longer ignore. Every episode of illness had occurred within hours of eating something Vivian had prepared for me. The pattern became impossible to ignore, though my heart fought against accepting what my rational mind was beginning to understand. Over the following weeks, I started keeping the food diary that Dr. Holloway had suggested, but not for the reasons she intended. Instead of tracking potential allergens or trigger foods, I was documenting something far more sinister, a methodical schedule of poisoning that followed Vivian's visits with clockwork precision. November brought an early snow to Willowbrook Creek, blanketing our town in pristine white that made everything look peaceful and innocent. But inside my cozy house on Maple Ridge Lane, I was living with a growing terror that I couldn't share with anyone, couldn't even fully acknowledge to myself. How do you accept that someone you love, someone you've welcomed into your family, might be systematically trying to kill you? Vivian's visits had increased in frequency since my health scares began. She'd arrive twice a week now, always with some thoughtful gift. Homemade soup when I mentioned feeling tired, herbal tea blends that she claimed would boost my immune system, vitamin supplements that she'd researched specifically for women my age. Her concern seemed so genuine, her care so devoted, that I found myself questioning my own suspicions, even as the evidence mounted. "You're like the mother I never had," she told me one gray afternoon in mid-November, settling beside me on the sofa with a cup of chamomile tea she'd specially prepared. My own mother was complicated, always critical, never satisfied with anything I did. But you, Eleanor, you make me feel valued, appreciated. I hope you know how much your acceptance has meant to me. Her words were delivered with such apparent sincerity, such vulnerability, that I felt ashamed of my dark thoughts. This was the woman who had held my hand during Theodore's funeral, who remembered every anniversary and birthday, who seemed genuinely invested in my well-being. Surely I was being paranoid, letting grief and loneliness twist innocent gestures into something malevolent. But then she'd leave, and within hours I'd be doubled over with the same excruciating symptoms: violent nausea, stomach cramps that felt like someone was twisting knives in my abdomen, weakness that left me barely able to stand. The episodes were becoming more severe, lasting longer, leaving me increasingly debilitated. Dr. Holloway ordered more tests, blood work, stool samples, even an endoscopy to examine my digestive system. Everything came back normal. My body showed no signs of disease, no indication of why I should be experiencing such severe symptoms. She began suggesting specialists, mentioned the possibility of rare autoimmune conditions, even gently broached the subject of psychological evaluation. Sometimes, she said carefully during one appointment, the mind can create very real physical symptoms as a way of processing trauma. Losing Theodore was a significant life change. It's possible your subconscious is manifesting stress in ways that your conscious mind isn't recognizing. I wanted to believe her medical explanation. It would have been so much easier to accept that I was suffering from some mysterious but ultimately treatable condition than to face the horrifying alternative that was taking shape in my mind. But the timing was too precise, the pattern too clear. I was only sick after consuming food or drinks that Vivian had prepared personally, with her own hands, in my own kitchen. The breakthrough came on a snowy Tuesday evening in early December. Vivian had arrived earlier that day with ingredients for her grandmother's famous chicken and dumplings recipe, insisting that comfort food was exactly what I needed to regain my strength. We'd spent a pleasant afternoon cooking together, and I genuinely enjoyed both her company and the delicious meal we'd prepared. But as we were cleaning up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I was loading dishes into the dishwasher when I saw Vivian reach into her purse and pull out a small, unmarked plastic container. She glanced around quickly, apparently checking to make sure I wasn't watching, then opened the container and shook what looked like white powder into my leftover portion of chicken and dumplings, the bowl I'd planned to have for lunch the next day. I froze, my hand still gripping a dinner plate, hardly able to breathe. Through the reflection in my kitchen window, I watched her stir the powder into the leftovers, her movements quick and practiced. Then she closed the container, slipped it back into her purse, and turned around with her usual bright smile. "Eleanor, you really should sit down and rest," she said warmly. "You've been on your feet all afternoon. Let me finish cleaning up." I managed to mumble something about needing to use the bathroom and escaped upstairs, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might burst from my chest. Standing in my bedroom, gripping the door frame for support, I finally accepted the truth I'd been fighting against for weeks. My daughter-in-law was poisoning me. The realization brought with it a cascade of other horrifying possibilities. How long had this been going on? What was she using? And most terrifying of all, why? What could she possibly gain from my death that she couldn't have while I was alive? When I returned to the kitchen 10 minutes later, having splashed cold water on my face and forced myself to appear normal, Vivian had finished cleaning and was gathering her things to leave. "I put your leftovers in the refrigerator," she said, giving me one of her warm hugs goodbye. "Make sure you eat them tomorrow for lunch. You need to keep your strength up." After she left, I stood in my kitchen staring at the refrigerator, knowing that it contained evidence of attempted murder but unsure what to do with that knowledge. Who would believe me? A 67-year-old widow claiming that her beloved daughter-in-law was trying to poison her? Without proof beyond my own observations, I'd sound like a paranoid old woman losing her grip on reality. I decided to conduct my own investigation. That night, I carefully removed my portion of leftovers from the refrigerator and scraped a small sample into a mason jar, which I labeled and stored in my basement freezer. If I was going to make accusations, I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the delusions of a grieving widow. Over the next several weeks, I became a different person, hypervigilant, suspicious, constantly on guard. I learned to watch Vivian's every move when she was in my kitchen, to document everything she brought me, to save samples of anything I suspected might be contaminated. I started declining her home-cooked meals, claiming I was following a special diet that Dr. Holloway had recommended. When that excuse wore thin, I began faking eating, pushing food around my plate, complimenting the flavors, while actually consuming as little as possible. The change in my behavior confused and hurt Vivian, or at least she acted confused and hurt. Her visits became more frequent, her concern more pronounced. "Eleanor, I'm really worried about you," she said one afternoon, her green eyes wide with apparent distress. "You've lost so much weight, and you seem distant lately. Are you sure you're telling me everything about how you're feeling?" Benjamin echoed her concerns during our nightly phone calls. "Mom, Vivian says you're not eating the meals she brings you. She's really hurt. And frankly, I'm concerned too. You're starting to look frail." I was losing weight. The constant stress and my reluctance to eat anything Vivian had prepared was taking its toll. But I was also gaining something else: clarity about the dangerous situation I was in, and the beginning of a plan to expose it. During my research at the Willowbrook Library, a place where I still felt safe and in control, I learned about various substances that could cause the symptoms I'd been experiencing. Arsenic, certain plant alkaloids, even common household chemicals could produce violent digestive episodes if administered in small, repeated doses. More chillingly, I discovered that this type of poisoning was notoriously difficult to detect unless doctors knew specifically what to look for. I also researched Vivian's background more thoroughly than I ever had before. What I found disturbed me deeply. Her previous job history was spotty, with long gaps that she'd explained away as periods of freelance work or caring for family members. More troubling, I found obituaries for 2 elderly relatives, her grandmother and a great-aunt, both of whom had died unexpectedly after brief illnesses and had left Vivian substantial inheritances. The pattern was becoming clear, but I still needed proof that would stand up in court. More importantly, I needed to stay alive long enough to present that proof. Vivian was becoming increasingly insistent about caring for me, more aggressive in pushing food and drinks, more concerned about my declining health. I could sense her frustration with my new reluctance to consume what she offered, and I feared that frustration might lead her to take more drastic action. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately save my life and bring Vivian to justice. Instead of continuing to avoid her attempts to poison me, I would appear to succumb to them. I would let Vivian Clearwater think she had succeeded in killing Eleanor Hartwell. But first, I had to gather enough evidence to ensure that when I rose from the dead, I could send her to prison for the rest of her life. The decision to fake my own death required more planning and preparation than I had ever undertaken in my 67 years of life. What I was contemplating wasn't just dangerous, it was a complete departure from everything I had ever been. I was a librarian, a church-going widow who had lived her entire adult life following rules, respecting authority, and trusting in the goodness of others. Now I was preparing to become someone else entirely, a woman capable of elaborate deception, strategic thinking, and cold calculation. The first challenge was gathering irrefutable evidence while staying alive long enough to use it. I couldn't simply stop eating Vivian's food indefinitely. She was already suspicious of my changed behavior, and Benjamin was pressuring me to be more gracious to his concerned wife. I needed to document her poisoning attempts in a way that would satisfy law enforcement, which meant I had to actually consume some of whatever she was giving me. This required a delicate balance. Too much, and I risked genuine organ damage or death. Too little, and she might suspect I was onto her scheme. I consulted medical texts at the library, researching symptoms of various poisons and their effects in different dosages. I learned about activated charcoal, which could help absorb toxins if taken quickly enough, and about ipecac syrup, which could induce vomiting to expel stomach contents before absorption occurred. My basement became a makeshift laboratory where I stored evidence and prepared for what I was privately calling Operation Resurrection. I purchased a small safe and installed it behind Theodore's old workbench, hidden beneath a pile of paint cans and gardening supplies. Inside, I kept detailed journals documenting every suspicious incident, photographs of the white powder I'd caught Vivian adding to my food, and carefully preserved samples of contaminated meals stored in labeled containers. The journaling became an obsession. I documented everything: the exact times of Vivian's visits, what she brought, how she behaved, when my symptoms appeared, how severe they were, and how long they lasted. I noted changes in her demeanor, inconsistencies in her stories, and the increasingly urgent quality of her concern for my health. December 15th, Vivian arrived at 2:30 p.m. with homemade vegetable soup, claimed she made it to help boost my immune system, added unknown white substance to my bowl while one was answering the phone, consumed approximately half the portion. Symptoms began at 5:45 p.m. Severe cramping, nausea, vomiting for 3 hours. Weakness lasted until the following morning. December 18th. Brought herbal tea blend, insisted I drink it while she was here. Watched me carefully to ensure I finished the entire cup. Symptoms more severe than previous episodes. Violent retching, cold sweats, racing heartbeat. Had to call in sick to community center volunteer work. The pattern was escalating. Vivian was becoming bolder, more insistent, and the doses were clearly increasing. I realized with growing alarm that she was losing patience with the gradual approach. Something had changed in her timeline, and she was moving toward a more aggressive strategy. The breakthrough came when I overheard a phone conversation that chilled me to the bone. I was upstairs in my bedroom, recovering from another poisoning episode, when I heard Vivian talking quietly on her cell phone in my kitchen. She thought I was sleeping, knocked out by whatever she'd given me with lunch, but the symptoms had been milder that day, because I'd managed to dispose of half the contaminated soup when she wasn't looking. "The old bird is tougher than I expected," she was saying, her voice carrying a hardness I'd never heard before. "I've been increasing the doses gradually, trying to make it look natural, but she keeps bouncing back. Maybe I need to try a different approach." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. No, Benjamin doesn't suspect anything. He thinks she's just declining naturally. You know how it is with elderly people. One day they're fine, the next day they're falling apart." Her laugh was cold, calculating. "He's actually been helping by pressuring her to eat more, to accept my care. He has no idea he's been my biggest ally in this." Another pause, longer this time. "The insurance policy is solid. I made sure of that. $2 million, and Benjamin inherits everything else. The house alone is worth at least $400,000, plus her savings, her retirement accounts. We're talking about enough money to completely change our lives." Insurance policy. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had never taken out a $2 million life insurance policy. The only policy I had was a small-term life policy that would barely cover my funeral expenses, which meant Vivian had somehow taken out a policy in my name, probably forged my signature, and was planning to collect on it after murdering me. By Christmas, this will all be over, she continued. Benjamin will inherit everything, and we'll finally be able to start our real life together, the life we deserve. No more pretending to care about boring small-town people. No more playing the dutiful daughter-in-law to an old woman who thinks her stories about library work are fascinating. The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This woman who had hugged me, who had called me the mother she'd never had, who had seemed to genuinely care about my well-being, was discussing my murder with the same tone someone might use to plan a grocery shopping trip. "Don't worry," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I've done this before, remember? It worked perfectly with Grandmother Catherine and Great-Aunt Helen. Natural causes, they said. Tragic how some elderly people just fade away. The only difference this time is the payout is so much bigger." Done this before. My hands were shaking as I processed what I'd just heard. Vivian had admitted to murdering at least 2 other elderly relatives, presumably for inheritance money. I wasn't her first victim. I was just the most lucrative one. After she left that day, I sat in my living room for hours, staring at the Christmas tree she had helped me decorate just the week before, trying to comprehend the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't a desperate act or a crime of passion. This was a woman who had made a career out of murdering elderly family members for money. She was a serial killer, and I was her current target. The realization that I was completely alone in this knowledge was terrifying. Benjamin was not only unaware of his wife's true nature, he was actively helping her by encouraging me to accept her care and eat her food. If I tried to tell him what I'd discovered, would he believe me? Or would he think his aging mother had developed paranoid delusions? Even if I went to the police immediately, what evidence did I have? Samples of food that might or might not contain poison, and my word against that of a woman who was beloved by everyone who knew her. Vivian had spent 3 years building her reputation in Willowbrook Creek as the perfect daughter-in-law, the caring wife, the helpful community member. I was a grieving widow who had been acting strangely for weeks, who had been losing weight and appearing increasingly frail. That night, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I would not just fake my death. I would orchestrate an elaborate deception that would give Vivian enough rope to hang herself. I would let her think she had succeeded in killing me, then document her behavior in the aftermath. I would gather evidence of the insurance fraud, record her conversations, and build an airtight case that would put her away for life. But first, I needed help. And there was only one person I trusted completely, someone who had known me long enough to believe even the most incredible story, my older sister, Helen Whitmore, who lived 200 miles away in Burlington. Helen was 3 years my senior, and had always been the more practical, skeptical sister. She'd never completely trusted Vivian, though she'd kept her suspicions to herself out of respect for Benjamin's happiness. When I called her that evening and asked her to come visit immediately because I had something urgent to discuss, she didn't hesitate. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," she said simply, "and Eleanor, whatever's wrong, we'll figure it out together. That's what sisters do." As I hung up the phone, I felt the first stirring of hope I'd experienced in weeks. I wasn't completely alone after all. And with Helen's help, I might just be able to pull off the most important performance of my life, playing dead long enough to expose a killer and bring her to justice. The countdown to my death had begun. Helen arrived at my house the next morning looking exactly like what she was, a retired high school principal who had spent 30 years dealing with teenage troublemakers and their elaborate schemes. At 70, she was still sharp as a tack, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at my pale, drawn face and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, settling into Theodore's old armchair with the no-nonsense efficiency that had made her legendary among students and faculty alike. "And don't try to tell me it's just grief or getting older. I buried my Harold 5 years ago, remember? I know what grief looks like, and this isn't it. This looks like fear." I had planned to ease into the conversation, to build up to the shocking revelation gradually. But Helen's direct approach made pretense impossible. So I told her everything. The pattern of illness following Vivian's visits, catching her, adding powder to my food, the overheard phone conversation about insurance policies and previous murders. I showed her my hidden evidence collection, my detailed journals, the samples I'd preserved in the basement freezer. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, she sat in silence for several long minutes, processing what she'd heard. Finally, she spoke. "That evil little witch," she said quietly, her voice carrying a cold fury I'd rarely heard from my typically composed sister. I knew there was something off about her from the beginning. Too perfect, too eager to please. But this... She shook her head grimly. "Eleanor, you realize she's going to kill you soon. Probably within the next week or two. Based on what you overheard. We need to call the police immediately." "With what evidence?" I asked. "Everything I have is circumstantial. Food samples that might contain something suspicious but might not. A conversation I overheard that she could deny. She spent 3 years building a reputation as the perfect daughter-in-law. Who's going to believe that sweet Vivian Clearwater is actually a serial killer?" Helen considered this, her principal's mind working through the problem methodically. "You're right," she admitted reluctantly. "Without solid proof, it would be your word against hers. And given your recent behavior, the weight loss, the apparent paranoia, she could easily paint you as a confused elderly woman suffering from delusions." That's when I outlined my plan to fake my own death and gather evidence while Vivian believed she'd succeeded. Helen's reaction was swift and predictable. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "Eleanor, what you're talking about is incredibly dangerous. If you miscalculate even slightly, you could end up actually dead. And even if you survive the initial deception, what happens when she realizes you're alive? Do you think she'll just accept defeat? She'll try to kill you again, and next time she'll make sure the job is done properly." But as we talked through the alternatives, and there weren't many, Helen gradually began to see the twisted logic in my plan. Vivian was escalating her attempts, growing bolder and more impatient. I was running out of time to build a conventional case against her. The fake death scenario would force her to reveal her true nature, to act on her murder plot in ways that could be documented and used as evidence. "If we're going to do this insane thing," Helen said finally, "we're going to do it right. And I mean professional level right. No room for mistakes, no half measures. Are you sure you're prepared for what this means?" What it meant was transforming my entire life into an elaborate lie. Helen and I spent the next 3 days planning every detail of my death and subsequent investigation. We researched medical conditions that could cause sudden cardiac arrest, studied the procedures that would follow an unexpected death, and identified all the ways Vivian might expose herself once she believed her plan had succeeded. Helen would be my secret ally on the outside, monitoring Vivian's behavior and gathering evidence while I was supposedly dead. We established communication protocols, using a prepaid cell phone Helen purchased with cash, setting up times and methods for checking in that wouldn't leave traceable records. The medical aspect of the deception required careful preparation. I researched drugs that could simulate death, substances that would slow my heart rate and breathing to barely detectable levels while keeping me conscious enough to control the situation. It was dangerous territory, but I found information about beta blockers and other medications that, in carefully controlled doses, could create the appearance of cardiac crisis without actually killing me. Dr. Holloway had prescribed mild sedatives to help with my anxiety about my recurring health issues. I had been saving them instead of taking them, building up a supply that I could use to help simulate a medical emergency. Combined with careful timing and staging, I might be able to create a convincing near-death episode that would trigger all of Vivian's post-murder behaviors. The hardest part was accepting that Benjamin would believe I was dead. My son would grieve for me, blame himself for not recognizing how seriously ill I was, and probably rely heavily on Vivian for comfort during his mourning period. The thought of putting him through that pain was almost enough to make me abandon the plan entirely. But Helen reminded me of the alternative. "If you don't do this, you'll actually be dead soon," she pointed out with her characteristic bluntness. "At least this way, Benjamin gets his mother back eventually, and he learns the truth about the woman he married before she kills someone else." We decided that my death should occur on a day when Vivian was scheduled to visit, making her either a witness or the person who discovered my body. This would put her at the center of the situation from the beginning, allowing us to observe her behavior and reactions from the moment she believed her plan had succeeded. The timing had to be perfect. Too early in her visit and she might attempt CPR or call 911 immediately. Too late, and she might become suspicious about why I had suddenly collapsed just as she was leaving. I needed to collapse at a moment when she would have opportunity to ensure I was truly dead, to perhaps even accelerate the process if she thought I might survive. Wednesday afternoons had become Vivian's regular visit time, when she typically brought lunch and stayed for 2 or 3 hours. She'd been increasingly insistent that I eat everything she prepared, watching me carefully to ensure I consumed every bite. Her frustration with my recent resistance was becoming more obvious, and I suspected she was planning something more dramatic for our next encounter. The night before the planned deception, I couldn't sleep. I lay in Theodore's and my bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. What if the simulation went wrong and I actually died? What if Vivian suspected something was off and called for immediate medical attention? What if my evidence wasn't enough to convict her, and I'd put myself through this ordeal for nothing? But then I remembered her voice on the phone, the casual way she'd discussed my murder, the revelation that she'd done this before to other elderly family members who had trusted her. I thought about some other woman out there who might become her next victim if I didn't stop her now. At 6 a.m., I got up and made coffee, my hands remarkably steady as I began the final preparations for the most important performance of my life. In 12 hours, Eleanor Hartwell would be dead. What remained to be seen was whether she would be able to rise from the grave to bring a killer to justice. Helen arrived at 7, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing the grim expression of someone preparing for battle. We went over the plan one final time, synchronized our watches, and reviewed all the contingencies we'd discussed. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked as we heard Vivian's car pulling into the driveway right on schedule. I looked out the window at my daughter-in-law's silver Honda, knowing that the woman behind the wheel was planning to murder me before the afternoon was over. "I'm certain," I replied, and surprised myself by meaning it completely. The final act was about to begin. Vivian's demeanor that Wednesday afternoon was different from her usual visits. There was an undercurrent of nervous energy beneath her practiced smile, a subtle urgency in her movements that confirmed my suspicions about her timeline. She arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing a dark blue sweater that made her green eyes appear almost predatory in the winter light filtering through my kitchen windows. "I made your favorite," she announced with theatrical brightness, lifting the lid to reveal what appeared to be her grandmother's famous beef stroganoff. "I know you haven't been eating well lately, so I wanted to prepare something really special, really nourishing." The irony of her word choice, nourishing, wasn't lost on me as I watched her bustle around my kitchen with proprietorial familiarity. She knew where every plate and utensil belonged, had memorized my preferences for how food should be served, and moved through the space like someone who already considered it her own. Helen had positioned herself in the living room with a clear view of the kitchen, ostensibly reading one of my library books but actually observing every interaction. We had agreed that she would witness whatever Vivian did to my food, providing a second set of eyes and ears for evidence collection. "Eleanor, you really do look pale today," Vivian said, studying my face with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Are you sure you've been taking those vitamins I brought you? And the herbal tea blend?" "I researched those supplements specifically for women our age. Well, your age. And they should be helping with your energy levels." Our age. She was 28 to my 67, but her slip revealed how she thought about our relationship. Two women in an intimate family bond, rather than the predator-prey dynamic that actually existed. The casual cruelty of someone who could maintain such a convincing facade while planning murder was breathtaking. As she served the stroganoff, I watched her movements with hypervigilant attention. She prepared 2 plates, one for each of us, moving naturally and openly. But when she brought my plate to the table, she positioned herself so that Helen couldn't see her final preparations. I caught the subtle movement of her hand reaching into her sweater pocket, the quick shake of something over my portion, the careful stirring to distribute whatever she'd added. "This smells absolutely wonderful," I said, picking up my fork and taking a small bite. The stroganoff was actually delicious, creamy and rich with tender beef and perfectly cooked noodles. If I hadn't known what else it contained, I would have enjoyed every bite. Vivian watched me eat with an intensity that might have seemed like normal hostess behavior to a casual observer, but I recognized it as the focused attention of someone monitoring the effectiveness of poison. She made conversation about the weather, about Benjamin's work, about her latest design projects, but her eyes never left my plate, tracking how much I consumed. I ate approximately half the portion, excusing the remainder by claiming I was still recovering from yesterday's digestive upset. This seemed to satisfy her. She didn't push for me to finish everything, which suggested she believed I'd consumed enough of whatever she'd administered to achieve her desired result. We moved to the living room for coffee and conversation, Helen joining us with her book still in hand. Vivian was animated and talkative, sharing stories about her childhood that I now suspected were complete fabrications designed to elicit sympathy and maintain her caring daughter-in-law image. It was during this seemingly pleasant conversation that I began my performance. At exactly 2:47 p.m., I allowed my coffee cup to slip slightly in my hands, catching it just before it fell but making the near miss obvious enough for both women to notice. "Oh my," I said, pressing my free hand to my chest. I felt a little dizzy there for a moment. Vivian's attention sharpened immediately. "Are you all right, Eleanor? You do look flushed." "I'm fine," I insisted, but let a slight tremor enter my voice. "Just a little lightheaded. Maybe I should have finished more of that delicious lunch." Over the next 20 minutes, I gradually escalated the symptoms. A few more instances of apparent dizziness, some subtle shortness of breath, occasional grimaces as if experiencing mild chest discomfort. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate medical intervention, but sufficient to establish a pattern of cardiac distress. Helen played her part perfectly, expressing growing concern while not being so alarmed as to call for emergency services. "Eleanor, maybe you should lie down for a bit," she suggested. "You've been pushing yourself too hard lately with all your volunteer work." But Vivian was the one whose behavior was most revealing. Rather than showing the escalating panic that a truly caring daughter-in-law might display, she seemed almost excited. Her questions about my symptoms were probing rather than comforting, designed to assess the progression of whatever poison she'd administered, rather than to provide reassurance. "When did the chest discomfort start?" she asked. "Is it a sharp pain or more of a pressure sensation? Are you having any trouble with your vision or hearing?" These were not the questions of someone worried about a loved one's health. These were the clinical inquiries of someone monitoring the effectiveness of a murder weapon. At 3:15 p.m., I decided it was time for the main event. "I think I need to use the bathroom," I announced, standing up slowly and swaying slightly, as if the movement had made me dizzy. Both women moved to help steady me, but I waved them off. "I'm fine. Just need a moment." I walked carefully to the downstairs bathroom, closed the door, and quickly took the combination of medications Helen and I had prepared. A carefully calculated dose designed to slow my heart rate and breathing while maintaining consciousness. The beta blockers would take several minutes to reach full effect, giving me time to return to the living room and position myself for the critical moment. When I emerged from the bathroom, I was moving even more slowly, one hand pressed to my chest in apparent distress. I began, then paused as if struggling to speak. "I think something's wrong." Helen immediately stood up, genuine alarm on her face despite knowing this was a performance. "Eleanor, you're scaring me. Maybe we should call Dr. Holloway." No, I insisted weakly. "I just need to sit down for a moment. I'm sure it will pass." But instead of sitting in my usual chair, I positioned myself on the sofa where I would have a clear view of both women's reactions to what happened next. The medications were beginning to take effect, and I could feel my heart rate slowing, my breathing becoming more shallow. Vivian was watching me with an intensity that was almost hypnotic, her green eyes bright with anticipation. She had moved closer, positioning herself where she could observe every nuance of my condition. When she thought Helen wasn't looking, I caught her checking the time on her watch, as if she had a schedule to maintain. "The pain is getting worse," I gasped, allowing myself to slump slightly against the sofa cushions. "It feels like someone is sitting on my chest." That's when Vivian made her move. "Helen," she said urgently, "could you get Eleanor a glass of water? I think she's becoming dehydrated, and that might be making the symptoms worse." It was a transparent attempt to get Helen out of the room, and my sister recognized it immediately. But she also understood that this might be the crucial moment we'd been waiting for. "Of course," Helen said, moving toward the kitchen. "Eleanor, try to stay calm. I'll be right back." The moment Helen left the room, Vivian's entire demeanor changed. The mask of concern slipped away, replaced by something cold and calculating. She moved quickly to kneel beside the sofa, her face close to mine, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's happening, isn't it, Eleanor?" she said, and there was satisfaction in her tone. "You can feel it working. Don't fight it. This is better for everyone. Better for you, better for Benjamin, better for me. You've lived a good long life, and now it's time to let go." Her words were like ice water in my veins, confirmation of everything I had suspected and more. She wasn't just watching me die. She was encouraging it, coaching me through my own murder like some twisted version of a midwife helping with a birth. "Benjamin will be so grateful for everything I've done for you," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "He'll see how devoted I was, how much I sacrificed to care for his aging mother. And when he inherits everything, when we can finally live the life we deserve, he'll understand that this was all for the best." I let my breathing become even more shallow, allowed my eyes to flutter as if I was losing consciousness. Through my partially closed lids, I watched Vivian reach into her purse and pull out her cell phone, but instead of calling 911, she opened what appeared to be a timer application. "Just a few more minutes," she murmured, apparently talking to herself. "Then I'll call for help, but not too soon. Can't have you surviving this, can we, Eleanor?" That's when I realized the full extent of her plan. She wasn't just poisoning me. She was timing my death, ensuring that any rescue attempt would come too late to save me, but soon enough to make her appear like a caring daughter-in-law who had tried desperately to help. As Helen's footsteps approached from the kitchen, Vivian quickly composed her face back into an expression of loving concern, slipping her phone back into her purse and taking my hand in what would appear to be a comforting gesture. "Eleanor," she said loudly enough for Helen to hear, "Eleanor, stay with me, you're going to be okay." But her grip on my hand was wrong. Not the gentle clasp of someone offering comfort, but the firm hold of someone checking for a pulse, monitoring the effectiveness of her poison. It was time to give her what she was waiting for. Taking the deepest breath I could manage with my slowed respiratory system, I let my body go completely limp, my eyes rolling back as if consciousness was leaving me entirely. My breathing became almost imperceptible, my pulse so slow that Vivian would need to search carefully to find it. "Oh God," I heard her say, but her tone wasn't panic. It was excitement poorly disguised as distress. Helen, come quickly. I think Eleanor is having a heart attack." And with those words, Vivian Clearwater began the process of revealing herself as the cold-blooded killer I knew her to be. Helen came running from the kitchen, water glass still in hand, her face a perfect picture of shocked concern that masked the calculating mind I knew was working beneath the surface. She dropped to her knees beside the sofa, reaching for my wrist to check my pulse, playing her role as the panicked sister while actually monitoring my condition to ensure I wasn't taking the deception too far. Eleanor, can you hear me?" she called out, her voice carrying just the right note of rising hysteria. Through my barely opened eyes, I watched her turn to Vivian with apparent desperation. "Should I call 911? What should we do?" But Vivian's response was telling. Instead of the immediate yes call for help that any normal person would have shouted, she hesitated, glancing at her phone again, with that same calculating expression I'd noticed before. "Wait," she said, moving closer to examine me more carefully. "Let me check her breathing first. Sometimes elderly people have these episodes, but they pass on their own. We don't want to traumatize her with paramedics, if it's not necessary." The audacity of her words was breathtaking. Here I was, apparently dying in front of her, and she was advocating against calling for emergency medical help. Helen caught it too. I could see the flash of fury in her eyes before she composed herself. "Are you sure?" Helen pressed. "She looks really bad, Vivian. I think we should call someone." "Just give me a moment to assess the situation," Vivian replied, and there was a new authority in her voice, as if she were suddenly the medical expert in the room. She leaned over me, placing her ear near my mouth and nose, ostensibly checking for breathing but actually determining whether I was still alive. What she found, my barely perceptible breath and almost undetectable pulse, seemed to satisfy her completely. I felt her hand move to my throat, fingers pressing against my carotid artery with the practiced motion of someone who had done this before. She held the position for a long moment, timing my heartbeat, calculating whether I was close enough to death to proceed with her plan. "Her pulse is very weak," she announced to Helen, but her tone carried satisfaction rather than alarm. "And her breathing is extremely shallow. I think she might be dying." The way she said those last words sent chills through me, even in my drugged state. There was anticipation in her voice, as if she were announcing good news rather than a tragedy. Helen, playing her part perfectly, let out a sob of apparent despair. No, this can't be happening," Helen cried. "She was fine just an hour ago. How can someone go downhill so fast?" "Sometimes it happens that way with heart problems," Vivian said with false gentleness, her hand still on my throat monitoring my pulse. "The elderly can seem stable one moment and then just fade away. It's actually a blessing, really. She won't suffer." "Won't suffer." The phrase revealed everything about how Vivian viewed what she was doing to me. In her twisted mind, she was providing a mercy killing, ending my life painlessly rather than letting me endure a prolonged decline. It was the rationalization of someone who had convinced herself that murder was actually kindness. "But shouldn't we call for help?" Helen insisted, her voice breaking with what appeared to be grief but was actually carefully controlled rage. "Maybe the paramedics could do something. Give her oxygen or medication or—" "Helen," Vivian interrupted, placing a comforting hand on my sister's shoulder. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is just let nature take its course. Eleanor has lived a full life. She's been struggling with these health issues for months now. Maybe this is just her time." Her time. As if my death were a natural conclusion rather than the result of systematic poisoning. But even more chilling was what happened next. Instead of continuing to monitor my condition or comfort my supposedly grieving sister, Vivian stood up and moved away from the sofa, pulling out her phone. But she wasn't calling 911. Through my barely opened eyes, I watched her scrolling through her contacts, and when she finally made a call, it wasn't to emergency services. "Benjamin," she said, her voice suddenly thick with tears that I now knew were completely manufactured. "Oh, Benjamin, you need to come home right away. Something terrible has happened to your mother." The performance was masterful. Her voice cracked at exactly the right moments. She paused as if overcome by emotion, and she provided just enough information to bring Benjamin rushing home without giving him time to ask detailed questions. "I don't know what happened," she continued. "She was fine, and then she just collapsed. Helen and I are with her now, but Benjamin, I think you need to prepare yourself. She's very, very sick." What struck me most was what she wasn't saying. No mention of calling paramedics, no urgency about getting medical help, no suggestion that time was of the essence. She was summoning Benjamin to witness my death, not to participate in saving my life. After she hung up, Vivian returned to the sofa, but her behavior had changed again. Instead of the caring daughter-in-law checking on her dying mother-in-law, she seemed almost businesslike, efficient in her movements as she arranged the scene to her satisfaction. "Helen," she said gently, "why don't you sit in the chair over there? I think Eleanor would want you to be comfortable while we wait with her." Wait with me, not wait for help to arrive, not wait to see if I would recover, but simply wait for me to die, for Benjamin to arrive, for whatever came next in her carefully orchestrated plan. She positioned herself beside the sofa where she could continue monitoring my vital signs, one hand resting on my wrist in what would appear to be a loving gesture but was actually a pulse check. Every few minutes, she would lean close to my face, checking my breathing, ensuring that her poison was still working as intended. "She's getting weaker," she reported to Helen with false sorrow. "Her pulse is becoming more irregular. I don't think it will be much longer now." The clinical detachment in her voice was terrifying. She was narrating my death like a nature documentary, observing the progression of symptoms with scientific interest rather than human emotion. This wasn't someone who had been driven to murder by desperation or passion. This was someone who had turned killing into a methodical process. When Benjamin's car screeched into the driveway 20 minutes later, Vivian immediately shifted back into grieving daughter-in-law mode. She positioned herself so that she would be the first person he saw when he burst through the door, and she arranged her face into an expression of tragic devastation. "Benjamin!" she cried as he ran into the house. "Thank God you're here. I don't know what to do. She just collapsed, and she's barely breathing." Benjamin rushed to the sofa, his face white with panic and grief. Seeing him in such genuine anguish, knowing that his pain was real while his wife's was completely fabricated, was almost more than I could bear. This was my son, the little boy I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I was putting him through the agony of watching me die. "Mom," he whispered, taking my other hand. "Mom, can you hear me? Please, please be okay." His voice was breaking, and I could feel tears on his fingers as he held my hand. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to open my eyes, to speak, to end his suffering. But I forced myself to remain motionless, knowing that this temporary pain was the only way to save him from a lifetime of being married to a killer. "How long has she been like this?" Benjamin asked Vivian, his voice thick with unshed tears. "About half an hour," she replied, moving to put her arms around him in a comforting embrace. "It happened so suddenly, Benjamin. One moment she was talking to us, and the next she just collapsed. I think it might be her heart." "Did you call 911?" he asked, and I held my breath waiting for her response. I wasn't sure," she said, her voice trembling with false uncertainty. She seemed so peaceful, and I know how much she hates hospitals. I thought maybe this is how she would want to go. At home, with family. It was a masterful manipulation, playing on Benjamin's knowledge of my personality and preferences to justify not seeking medical help. She was painting herself as someone who respected my wishes rather than someone who was ensuring my death. "But we have to try," Benjamin insisted, reaching for his phone. "We have to do something." "Wait," Vivian said quickly, catching his hand. "Look at her, Benjamin. Really look at her. She's not in pain. Her breathing is so shallow, her pulse so weak. Do we really want to put her through the trauma of CPR, of machines, of a sterile hospital room? Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is just let go." The psychological pressure she was applying was extraordinary. She was using Benjamin's love for me as a weapon, convincing him that calling for help would actually be cruel rather than caring. And I could see it working. His hand hesitated over his phone, his face torn between the desperate desire to save me and the fear of causing me suffering. That's when Vivian made the mistake that would ultimately destroy her. "She's had such a hard time since your father died," she continued softly. "Maybe this is a blessing. Maybe she's ready to be with Theodore again." But as she spoke these words of false comfort, I saw her checking her watch again, and there was satisfaction in her expression as she noted the time. She was timing my death, documenting when it occurred, building her timeline for whatever story she planned to tell investigators. And that's when I knew I had gathered enough evidence to destroy her completely. It was time for Eleanor Hartwell to come back from the dead. The moment I chose to resurrect myself was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Benjamin was leaning over me, tears streaming down his face as he whispered what he believed were his final words to his dying mother. Vivian stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort, but I could see her checking her watch one more time, timing what she believed was my final breath. Helen sat across the room, her face a mask of grief that concealed her readiness to spring into action the moment I gave the signal. Everything was perfectly positioned for what would be the most important performance of my life, not the performance of dying, but the performance of coming back to expose a killer. I began slowly, allowing my breathing to deepen almost imperceptibly at first. The beta blockers I'd taken were wearing off naturally, and I could feel my heart rate beginning to normalize. The key was to make my recovery seem gradual and realistic, not like someone who had been faking all along. "Benjamin," I whispered, so softly that he had to lean closer to hear me. His face immediately transformed from grief to desperate hope. "Mom? Mom, are you there? Can you hear me?" I allowed my eyes to flutter open, appearing disoriented and confused, as if I were swimming back to consciousness from a very dark place. "Where? What happened?" I managed to say, my voice weak and shaky. Benjamin's sob of relief was heartbreaking. "You collapsed, Mom. You've been unconscious for almost an hour. We thought we were losing you." But it was Vivian's reaction that I was really watching. The woman who had been carefully timing my death now looked as if she'd seen an actual ghost. Her face went completely white, her mouth falling open in shock that she quickly tried to disguise as relief. But I caught that split second of pure horror, the moment when she realized her carefully orchestrated murder had somehow failed. "Eleanor!" she exclaimed, but her voice carried a note of panic rather than joy. "Oh my God, you scared us so badly. How are you feeling? Are you in any pain?" I studied her face carefully as I answered. "I feel strange, weak, like I've been somewhere very far away." I paused, allowing confusion to cloud my features. "What time is it? How long was I?" "About 45 minutes, Helen said, moving closer to the sofa. "We were so frightened, Eleanor. You just collapsed without warning." Vivian was frantically trying to regain her composure, but I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. If I had survived whatever dose she'd given me, she needed to understand why. Needed to assess whether I might remember what had happened before I collapsed. "Do you remember anything about what you were feeling before?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Any chest pain, dizziness, anything that might help us understand what happened?" It was a probing question designed to determine whether I had any memory of the poisoning or her behavior afterward. I decided to give her exactly what she was looking for: apparent confusion and memory gaps that would suggest I had no idea what had really happened. "I remember having lunch," I said slowly, as if struggling to piece together fragments of memory. "We were talking in the living room, having coffee, then nothing. Just darkness, and a strange feeling like I was floating." Relief flooded Vivian's face. If I couldn't remember the events leading up to my collapse, then I couldn't identify any suspicious behavior or recall anything incriminating she might have said. "That's probably a blessing," she said softly. "Sometimes when people have these cardiac episodes, it's better not to remember the frightening parts." Cardiac episodes. She was already constructing the narrative that would explain what had happened to me, creating a medical explanation that would satisfy everyone and deflect suspicion from the real cause. Benjamin was still holding my hand, his relief palpable. "We need to get you to the hospital, Mom. Dr. Holloway needs to examine you, run some tests. This could happen again." "No," I said quickly, then tried to soften my refusal. I'm feeling better now. Whatever happened seems to have passed. I don't want to spend the night in a hospital if it's not necessary." This was part of my strategy. I needed to avoid medical examination that might detect traces of whatever Vivian had given me, at least until I could implement the next phase of my plan. But my refusal also served another purpose. It would force Vivian to try again, and next time I would be ready to catch her in the act. "Eleanor, I really think you should see a doctor," Vivian insisted, and there was genuine urgency in her voice now. "What if this happens again when you're alone? What if next time—" She let the sentence trail off, but the implication was clear. "What if next time you actually die, as you were supposed to this time?" "I'll call Dr. Holloway first thing in the morning," I promised. "But for now, I just want to rest in my own bed, in my own house. Being here, with all of you, is the best medicine I could ask for." Helen stood up, moving into her role as the concerned sister taking charge. "I think Eleanor's right. She seems much more stable now, and the stress of a hospital visit might actually be counterproductive. I'll stay the night, keep an eye on her." This was exactly what we had planned. Helen's presence would prevent Vivian from making another immediate attempt on my life, while also providing a witness to any suspicious behavior. Vivian's frustration was barely concealed. "Are you sure that's wise? If Eleanor has another episode during the night—" "Then we'll call 911 immediately," Helen said firmly. "But right now, she needs rest and quiet." As Benjamin prepared to leave, I could see Vivian calculating her next move. She'd been so close to success, had actually believed I was dead, and now she was back to square one. Worse, she had no way of knowing why her poison had failed or whether I might remember more than I was letting on. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," she announced. "Maybe I can bring some of that herbal tea that always seems to help Eleanor feel better." The casual mention of the tea sent chills through me. I now recognized it as probably one of her delivery methods, something I consumed regularly, that she could easily dose with whatever substance she was using to poison me. "That's so thoughtful of you," I said warmly, playing the role of the grateful mother-in-law. "You're always taking such good care of me, Vivian." "I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Here I was, thanking the woman who had just tried to murder me for her care, while she smiled and accepted the praise for her devotion. After Benjamin and Vivian left, Helen and I waited a full 30 minutes before speaking freely, ensuring they were truly gone and wouldn't return unexpectedly. "That was the most terrifying performance I've ever witnessed," Helen said finally, sinking into a chair with visible relief. "When I saw you lying there, barely breathing, for a moment I forgot it was an act. I thought something had gone wrong with your plan." "It almost did," I admitted. "Those medications affected me more than I expected. There were moments when I wasn't entirely sure I could come back from it." "But we got what we needed," Helen said, her expression grim with satisfaction. "We have a witness to her behavior, to the things she said while she thought you were dying. and now we know for certain that she'll try again. The question is when and how, I replied. She's going to be more careful now, more suspicious. She knows something went wrong, even if she can't figure out what. We spent the next hour reviewing everything that had happened, with Helen providing details about Vivian's behavior that I hadn't been able to observe while unconscious. The picture that emerged was damning. A woman who had shown more interest in timing my death than in saving my life, who had actively discouraged seeking medical help, and who had displayed satisfaction rather than grief at what she believed was my passing. "There's something else," Helen said as we prepared for bed. "While you were unconscious, I managed to get a look at her phone when she was checking the time. She had a stopwatch running, Eleanor. She was literally timing how long you'd been down." A stopwatch. The coldness of that detail was staggering. Vivian hadn't just been monitoring my death. She'd been documenting it with scientific precision, probably to ensure she could provide accurate timelines to authorities when they investigated. "That's not normal behavior for someone trying to save a life," I said grimly. "That's the behavior of someone managing a murder." As I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling and processing everything that had happened, I realized that the most dangerous part of my plan was still ahead of me. Vivian knew her first attempt had failed, and she would be desperate to complete her mission before I could recover enough to seek medical attention that might expose her methods. She would try again soon, probably within the next few days, and when she did, I needed to be ready not just to survive her next attempt, but to catch her in the act in a way that would provide irrefutable evidence of her guilt. The game of cat and mouse had entered its final phase, and only one of us would survive it. The revelation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about Vivian's crimes came from an unexpected source: her own arrogance and the assumption that I was too close to death to be a threat. What I discovered over the next 72 hours would transform my understanding of just how calculating and experienced a killer she truly was. The morning after my resurrection, I felt genuinely weak and shaky from the medications I'd taken, which actually helped maintain the illusion that I was recovering from a serious cardiac episode. Helen stayed close, playing the role of concerned sister while we both waited for Vivian's next move. We didn't have to wait long. She arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a thermos of what she claimed was her special healing tea blend, and wearing an expression of such convincing concern that I almost doubted my own knowledge of her true nature. Her ability to shift between personas was genuinely frightening. In the space of a day, she'd gone from coldly timing my death to appearing genuinely devoted to my recovery. "I was so worried about you all night," she said, embracing me with what felt like authentic warmth. "I barely slept, thinking about what happened yesterday. You gave us such a scare." "I'm feeling much better this morning," I assured her, accepting the tea she'd prepared. Whatever that episode was, it seems to have passed. But I noticed several things that Helen and I had prepared to watch for. Vivian's eyes were constantly scanning my face for signs of weakness or confusion. She asked probing questions about my memory of the previous day. Most tellingly, she seemed disappointed rather than relieved when I appeared stronger than expected. "You know, Eleanor," she said carefully, "I really think you should consider staying with Benjamin and me for a few days. Just until we're sure these episodes aren't going to continue. You shouldn't be alone after something like that." It was a reasonable-sounding suggestion, but I understood its true purpose. If I was staying in her house, she would have complete control over everything I ate and drank, making it much easier to complete her mission without witnesses. "That's very kind of you," I replied, "but I think I'm more comfortable here in my own surroundings. Besides, Helen is staying with me for now." The flash of irritation that crossed Vivian's face was quickly masked, but I caught it. Helen's continued presence was interfering with her plans, creating complications she didn't want to deal with. Over the next hour, as we sat in my living room making conversation, Vivian excused herself twice to use the bathroom. Both times I noticed her taking her purse with her, behavior that struck me as odd until I realized what she was probably doing. The second time she left, Helen quickly followed, claiming she needed to retrieve something from upstairs. What Helen discovered would provide the breakthrough we needed. She was on the phone, Helen whispered to me when she returned, while Vivian was still in the bathroom. I heard her talking to someone, and Eleanor. She was discussing insurance policies, something about making sure the paperwork was filed properly, and whether there would be any complications from your recovery. Insurance paperwork. That confirmed what I'd suspected about the forged life insurance policy, but it also suggested something more immediate. If Vivian was discussing paperwork complications from my survival, it meant she was preparing to file a claim, probably based on the assumption that her next attempt would be successful. But the real revelation came when Vivian's phone rang as she was preparing to leave that morning. She answered without thinking, and her side of the conversation revealed information that changed everything. "Yes, I understand the timeline," she said, walking toward my kitchen for privacy, but not quite far enough. "No, there was a complication yesterday, but it's being handled." "What do you mean? Are there others?" "Of course there are others. This isn't my first time doing this kind of work." This kind of work. The phrase sent chills through me. She wasn't just talking about murdering elderly relatives for inheritance money. She was talking about it as if it were a profession, a service she provided. "Look, I've done this successfully 4 times before," she continued, her voice growing more agitated. "Grandmother Catherine, Great-Aunt Helen, the old man in Burlington, and that woman in Rutland. They all looked completely natural. The authorities never suspected anything. 4 times before." My hands were shaking as the full scope of what I was hearing sank in. Vivian wasn't just a woman who had murdered 2 relatives as I'd originally thought. She was a serial killer who had made a career out of targeting elderly people for their money. The Hartwell situation is more complicated because of the son's emotional attachment, she was saying, but the payout is significantly larger than the previous jobs. $2 million plus the inheritance makes it worth the extra effort. Jobs. She was discussing murder as if she were a contractor discussing home renovation projects. The casual, businesslike tone was more chilling than if she'd sounded angry or emotional. This was someone who had completely dehumanized her victims, reducing them to financial opportunities. When she returned to the living room, her demeanor was slightly different, more focused, more determined. I suspected that whoever she'd been talking to had given her instructions or a deadline, increasing the pressure to complete my murder. "Eleanor," she said, settling beside me on the sofa with renewed intensity, "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I really believe you need to be under closer medical supervision. Not necessarily in a hospital, but maybe we could arrange for a private nurse to stay with you." "A private nurse." I exchanged a glance with Helen, both of us understanding the implications immediately. Vivian wanted someone she could control in my house, someone who might be an accomplice, or at least someone she could manipulate into leaving her alone with me. "I don't think that's necessary," I said firmly. "Helen is perfectly capable of helping me with anything I need." "But Helen isn't medically trained," Vivian pressed. "What if you have another episode? What if next time it's more serious? What if next time she used a larger dose of poison and needed someone present who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions about my sudden deterioration?" That afternoon, after Vivian left, Helen and I made a decision that would prove crucial to exposing the full extent of her crimes. Instead of waiting for her next murder attempt, we would take the offensive and gather evidence about her previous victims. Helen had a friend who worked for the Vermont State Police, a retired detective named Robert Granger, who specialized in cold cases. When Helen called him that evening and explained that we had information about possible serial murders disguised as natural deaths, he agreed to meet with us the next day. "But I need you to understand," he warned, "that if what you're telling me is true, you're in immediate danger. Serial killers don't just stop because one attempt fails. If this woman has killed 4 people, she'll definitely try to kill you again." The meeting with Detective Granger opened my eyes to just how sophisticated Vivian's operation really was. When he ran the names she'd mentioned on the phone, Catherine Clearwater, Helen Morrison, and the victims in Burlington and Rutland, a disturbing pattern emerged. All 4 deaths had occurred over the past 6 years. All involved elderly people with substantial assets and no close family except for Vivian, who had inserted herself into their lives as a caregiver. All had died suddenly after brief illnesses that mimicked natural causes. And in each case, Vivian had inherited significant sums of money. "This isn't opportunistic killing," Detective Granger explained as he showed us the files. "This is systematic, predatory behavior. She identifies vulnerable elderly people, gains their trust, isolates them from other potential heirs, and then murders them in ways that appear natural." But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. When Detective Granger expanded his search to include similar deaths throughout New England, he found 3 more possible victims. Elderly people who had died under suspicious circumstances, all with connections to a young woman matching Vivian's description. "If our suspicions are correct," he said grimly, "you're not dealing with someone who made a few desperate choices. You're dealing with a professional killer who has made murder her career. And based on the escalating timeline, she's getting more confident, more efficient, and more dangerous." 7 possible victims. The number was staggering. How many families had mourned loved ones who they thought had died natural deaths, never knowing they'd actually been murdered? How many wills had been changed? How many inheritances had been stolen through calculated killing? "We need to move fast," Detective Granger continued. "If she's following the pattern from her previous murders, she'll try to complete this one within the next few days. She can't afford to let you recover enough to seek medical attention that might expose her methods." That evening, as Helen and I sat in my living room planning our next moves, we realized that everything had changed. This was no longer just about saving my life or exposing one woman's crimes against her family. We were potentially stopping a serial killer who had been operating successfully for years, who had refined her methods to near perfection, and who showed no signs of stopping. "The question is," Helen said quietly, "how do we catch her in the act without giving her the opportunity to actually kill you?" Because based on what Detective Granger said, her next attempt is going to be her most aggressive yet. I looked around my living room, at the home Theodore and I had built together, at the life I'd created over decades of honest work and genuine relationships. Tomorrow, I would put everything at risk in an attempt to stop a woman who had turned murder into a profession. But I also knew that if I didn't stop her, she would continue killing until someone finally caught her. And by then, how many more elderly people would have died, their families never knowing they'd been victims of calculated murder rather than natural causes? The final confrontation was coming, and this time, only one of us would walk away. The trap we set for Vivian required every ounce of strategic thinking Helen and I possessed, combined with technology and law enforcement resources that Detective Granger provided. We had 48 hours to create a scenario that would force Vivian to reveal her true nature while ensuring I survived the encounter. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Not just my life, but the possibility of preventing future murders and bringing justice for her previous victims. Detective Granger's plan was elegantly simple in concept but terrifying in execution. We would create circumstances that would pressure Vivian into making her final murder attempt under controlled conditions, with multiple forms of surveillance recording every moment. The key was making her believe she had the perfect opportunity while actually ensuring she walked directly into a trap. The first element was removing Helen from the equation in a way that would seem natural and urgent. Detective Granger arranged for Helen to receive a phone call Friday morning about a fabricated family emergency. Her daughter in California had supposedly been in a car accident and needed her immediately. Helen played her part perfectly, expressing genuine distress about leaving me alone so soon after my cardiac episode. "I can't leave you, Eleanor," she said, loud enough for Vivian to hear when she called to check on me that morning. "Not after what happened Wednesday. What if you have another attack while I'm gone?" "Don't be ridiculous," I replied, following our script. "Your daughter needs you. I'll be fine for a few days. Besides, Vivian checks on me constantly. I'm not really alone." I could practically hear Vivian's wheels turning through the phone. With Helen gone, and me apparently still weak from my previous episode, this would be her ideal opportunity to finish what she'd started. "Eleanor, I insist on staying with you while Helen is away," Vivian said immediately. "I won't take no for an answer. You shouldn't be alone right now." Perfect. She was volunteering for exactly what we needed her to do. Isolate herself with me in circumstances where she would feel compelled to act quickly. The second element was the technological surveillance that would document everything. Detective Granger's team had spent Thursday installing micro cameras and audio recording equipment throughout my house, focusing on the kitchen and living room where Vivian typically spent time during her visits. The equipment was so small and well concealed that even someone actively looking for it would have difficulty finding it. They also provided me with a pendant that looked like a medical alert device but was actually a panic button connected directly to police dispatch. If the situation became genuinely life-threatening, help would arrive within 3 minutes. The third and most dangerous element was the psychological pressure we planned to apply. Instead of playing the confused, memory-impaired victim as I had been doing, I would gradually reveal that I remembered more about Wednesday's episode than I'd initially indicated. This would create urgency for Vivian. If I was recovering memories of her suspicious behavior, she would need to act before I could share those memories with anyone else. Friday afternoon, after Helen had tearfully departed for her fake emergency, Vivian arrived with an overnight bag and enough food for several days. Her demeanor was different again, more possessive, more controlling, as if she were taking charge of the situation rather than simply helping out during a crisis. "I'm going to take such good care of you," she said, unpacking groceries in my kitchen. "We'll get you back to full strength in no time." But her actions contradicted her words. Instead of foods that would genuinely help someone recover from illness, she'd brought items that would be easy to contaminate: soups, teas, smoothie ingredients. Everything she'd purchased could be easily dosed with whatever poison she'd been using. That evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, I began the psychological pressure campaign. "Vivian," I said hesitantly, "I've been having some strange dreams since Wednesday. Actually, I'm not sure they're dreams. They feel more like memories trying to surface." Her attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of memories, Eleanor?" "Fragments, mostly. I remember being on the sofa, feeling very sick. And I remember voices, people talking about me as if I wasn't there." I paused, watching her face carefully. "Some of the things I remember hearing, they don't make sense. They couldn't have really happened." "Dreams can be very vivid after a traumatic medical event," she said quickly. "The brain sometimes creates false memories to fill in gaps. You shouldn't put too much stock in these impressions." But I could see the worry in her eyes. If I was remembering her words from Wednesday, remembering her checking her watch and timing my death, she was in serious trouble. "Maybe you're right," I said with apparent uncertainty, "but they feel so real. I keep hearing someone say something about it being better for everyone, and something about not fighting it, and there was something about Benjamin inheriting." I trailed off, shaking my head as if confused. Vivian went very still. Those were almost exact quotes from what she'd said to me while she thought I was dying, words that no one else should have been able to hear. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "I think you might be mixing up reality with dreams, or maybe even television shows you've watched. People say all kinds of things on medical dramas that might be influencing these false memories." False memories. She was working hard to convince me that what I remembered wasn't real, but her very effort to dismiss my recollections confirmed their accuracy. Saturday morning brought the escalation we'd been expecting. Vivian was up early, preparing what she claimed was a special breakfast designed to boost my energy and help my recovery. I watched her closely as she worked, noting how she positioned herself to block my view of certain preparations, how she kept reaching into her purse for something she then palmed in her hand. "This is a protein smoothie with all kinds of wonderful vitamins and supplements," she announced, handing me a large glass of pale pink liquid. "I researched the best recovery foods for cardiac patients, and this has everything you need." The smoothie looked innocent enough, but I noticed that she hadn't prepared one for herself, claiming she'd already eaten. This was clearly intended to be a major dose of whatever she'd been using to poison me, probably enough to finish the job this time. "This is so thoughtful of you," I said, accepting the glass but not immediately drinking. "You're always taking such good care of me." "Drink it while it's fresh," she urged. "The nutrients are most effective when consumed immediately." I raised the glass to my lips, pretending to take a sip while actually allowing only a tiny amount to touch my tongue. Even that small taste had a slightly bitter aftertaste that confirmed my suspicions about contamination. "It's delicious," I lied, setting the glass down. "But it's quite large. I'll need to pace myself or I'll be too full for lunch." Vivian's frustration was evident, though she tried to hide it. "Eleanor, it's really important that you drink all of it. The supplements work best when taken in specific dosages." As the morning progressed, she became increasingly insistent that I finish the smoothie, growing more agitated each time I deflected or delayed. By noon, she was barely controlling her desperation. "Eleanor, you've barely touched your smoothie," she said, her voice tight with poorly concealed frustration. "I went to a lot of trouble to research the exact ingredients for optimal cardiac recovery. Don't you want to get better?" "Of course I do," I replied, picking up the glass again. "I just keep getting distracted by these strange memory fragments. They're becoming clearer, actually. More detailed." That stopped her cold. "What do you mean, more detailed?" "I'm starting to remember specific things people said while I was unconscious," I said slowly, as if the memories were genuinely returning gradually. "Things about insurance policies, and how it would be better for Benjamin if I didn't recover." Vivian's face went pale. "Eleanor, that's impossible. You were unconscious the entire time. People say all kinds of things when they're frightened and upset. You can't trust these supposed memories." "But they're so specific," I pressed. "I remember someone checking their watch, someone talking about timing. And there was something about this not being the first time." I let the sentence hang in the air, watching as the full horror of her situation dawned on Vivian. If I remembered her phone conversation about her previous murders, if I could provide specific details about her behavior during my death, she was facing not just failure but exposure and imprisonment. "You need to drink that smoothie right now," she said, her voice suddenly hard and commanding. "All of it. Your recovery depends on it." The mask was finally slipping. The caring daughter-in-law was disappearing, replaced by someone desperate and dangerous. I could see her calculating whether she could force me to consume the poisoned drink, whether she could make my death look accidental if I refused to cooperate. That's when I made the decision that would end this deadly game once and for all. "Actually, Vivian," I said, standing up and facing her directly, "I remember everything. Every word you said while you thought I was dead. Every time you checked your watch. Every detail about your previous victims and your insurance fraud scheme." Her face transformed completely, all pretense of care and concern evaporating. What remained was cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "You clever old bitch," she said quietly. "You've been playing me this whole time." And with those words, Vivian Clearwater finally revealed herself as the killer she truly was. The transformation in Vivian's demeanor was instant and terrifying. Gone was every trace of the caring daughter-in-law who had fooled my entire family and community for 3 years. What stood before me now was a cold-blooded killer who had been cornered and was calculating her next move with predatory precision. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice eerily calm as she moved between me and the door, cutting off my most obvious escape route. Her green eyes, which I had always thought beautiful, now looked reptilian in their complete lack of warmth or humanity. Long enough to gather evidence that will put you away for the rest of your life, I replied, fighting to keep my own voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. The police know about Catherine, Helen, the victims in Burlington and Rutland. They know about the forged insurance policy. They know everything. Vivian laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. Do they really? Because from where I'm standing, you're a paranoid old woman who's been acting increasingly unstable since her husband died. Who's going to believe your wild stories about attempted murder when I'm the grieving daughter-in-law who tried so hard to care for you? She was still thinking like the manipulator she'd always been, still believing she could control the narrative even now. But I could see the desperation behind her bravado, the recognition that her carefully constructed life was crumbling around her. The cameras will believe me, I said quietly, and watched her face change as the implications hit her. What cameras? She demanded, her eyes darting around the room. The ones that have been recording everything since yesterday morning. The ones that captured you preparing that poisoned smoothie. The ones that recorded every word of this conversation. For the first time since I'd known her, Vivian looked genuinely rattled. She was scanning the room frantically now, searching for equipment she couldn't see, realizing that her final murder attempt had been documented from beginning to end. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Detective Robert Granger of the Vermont State Police doesn't bluff, I replied. Neither do the federal investigators who are currently examining the deaths of your previous 7 victims. 7 victims. I had deliberately inflated the number, wanting to see her reaction. What I saw confirmed my worst fears about the scope of her crimes. 7, she repeated, and there was something almost like pride in her voice. Is that what they think? They haven't even found all of them yet. The casual admission that she had killed more than 7 people made my blood run cold. This woman was a more prolific serial killer than anyone had imagined, someone who had been murdering elderly people for years with such skill that most of her crimes hadn't even been recognized as murders. But her moment of boastful pride had also revealed something crucial. She was losing control, letting her guard down, making mistakes. The careful facade she'd maintained for so long was cracking under pressure. It doesn't matter now, she said, her voice taking on a flat, businesslike tone that was somehow more frightening than if she'd been screaming. You've made this much more complicated than it needed to be, Eleanor. I tried to make it peaceful for you, tried to let you drift away quietly. But you had to be difficult. She moved closer, and I could see her evaluating me physically, calculating whether she could overpower a 67-year-old woman without leaving obvious signs of violence. I realized that she was shifting to a more direct approach. If poison wasn't going to work, she would find another method. Benjamin will be devastated when he finds you, she continued conversationally. His poor mother, who seemed to be recovering so well, who suffered another massive cardiac episode while he was at work. The stress of Helen's departure, the worry about being alone, it will all make perfect sense. She was still planning my murder, still believing she could make it look natural, despite everything that had happened. The depth of her delusion was staggering. The only problem, I said, backing slowly toward the kitchen where I knew Detective Granger's team was monitoring everything, is that Benjamin already knows the truth. This was a lie, but I delivered it with complete conviction. Vivian froze, her face going pale again. That's impossible. Benjamin adores me. He would never believe. He would believe evidence, I interrupted. Audio recordings of you timing my death. Video footage of you poisoning my food. Bank records showing the forged insurance policy. Phone records documenting your conversations about previous murders. With each piece of evidence I mentioned, Vivian seemed to deflate a little more. She was finally understanding that her situation was hopeless, that the careful life she'd built was completely destroyed. You have no idea what you've done, she said, her voice becoming bitter and desperate. Do you know what my life was like before I figured out how to take control? Growing up poor, Watching my mother work herself to death in other people's houses, never having anything, never being anything. These people I killed, they had everything handed to them. They lived their whole lives in comfort, while people like my family struggled just to survive. It was a twisted justification, an attempt to frame serial murder as some kind of social justice. But I could hear the genuine resentment in her voice, the years of anger and entitlement that had led her down this path. "So you decided you deserved what they had, even if it meant killing them for it," I said. "I decided to stop being a victim," she snapped. "I decided to take what I wanted instead of waiting for someone to give it to me, and it worked perfectly until you had to ruin everything." That's when she lunged at me. Despite her slender build, Vivian was 39 years younger than me and driven by desperate fury. She hit me with enough force to knock me backward into the kitchen counter, her hands immediately going for my throat. For a terrifying moment, I thought my elaborate plan had failed, that I would die at her hands just as surely as if I'd consumed her poison. But Detective Granger's team had been watching and listening to everything. Before Vivian could get a solid grip on my neck, my front door exploded inward, and armed police officers flooded into my house. "Vermont State Police! Let her go and get on the ground!" Vivian's head snapped up, her eyes wild with rage and disbelief. For a moment, I thought she might try to use me as a hostage. But faced with multiple officers pointing weapons at her, she finally released her grip and stepped back, her hands raised in surrender. "Vivian Clearwater," Detective Granger said as officers moved to handcuff her. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Eleanor Hartwell and suspected involvement in multiple homicides spanning 6 years." As they read her rights, Vivian looked directly at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, Eleanor," she said. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've unleashed." But it was over. As they led her away in handcuffs, I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment that went beyond my own survival. How many elderly people would be alive today because Vivian Clearwater would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable victims? The trial that followed became one of the most sensational murder cases in Vermont history. The evidence we had gathered, the audio recordings, the video surveillance, the documentation of her previous crimes, built an overwhelming case against her. Additional investigations revealed that she had actually killed 11 elderly people over 6 years, stealing over $4 million through forged insurance policies and manipulated inheritances. Benjamin's testimony was particularly powerful. When he learned the truth about his wife's crimes, he was devastated, but ultimately chose to support justice over loyalty. His description of the subtle ways Vivian had manipulated him into pressuring me to accept her care showed the jury just how calculating and thorough her methods had been. On the day of sentencing, I chose to address the court directly, speaking not just for myself but for all of Vivian's victims who could no longer speak for themselves. "Vivian Clearwater didn't just steal money," I said, looking directly at her as she sat at the defendant's table. "She stole years of life from people who trusted her. She stole the natural deaths that her victims deserved. She stole the grief of families who never knew their loved ones had been murdered." The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable elderly people. Today, 2 years later, I live a life I never could have imagined during those dark months when I was slowly being poisoned. My relationship with Benjamin has been rebuilt on a foundation of complete honesty and mutual respect. He's in therapy, working through the trauma of learning that the woman he loved was a serial killer, but he's healing. I've become an advocate for elder abuse prevention, speaking at conferences, and working with law enforcement to develop better protocols for recognizing and investigating suspicious deaths among elderly people. Detective Granger and I have become close friends, united by our shared experience of bringing a dangerous killer to justice. And I've learned something profound about the strength that lies dormant within us until we need it most. When faced with the ultimate test, the choice between accepting victimhood and fighting for survival, I discovered reserves of courage and cunning I never knew I possessed. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who wear the masks of love and care. But sometimes, just sometimes, their intended victims are stronger and smarter than they ever imagined. The greatest gift I gave myself wasn't surviving Vivian's attempt to murder me. It was refusing to die quietly when someone decided my life was worth less than their greed. And that, my friends, is a gift we all deserve to give ourselves. The gift of fighting back, of demanding justice, of refusing to be anyone's victim, no matter how hopeless the situation might seem. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is come back from the dead to tell your story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.